Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy. When did you get posted to the F-8 Crusader?
Well, I went to flight training in 1963, and everybody goes through different pipelines, if you want to call it that, in the training command. And at the completion of that, when you are awarded your golden wings for naval aviators, then you'll receive a set of orders, and obviously wherever you're going to depends on what kind of airplane you're going to be flying. Naval aviation is a little unusual in that it has numerous options, if you will, once you're designated. That they have the carrier-based tactical aviation, but then they have a land-based multi-engine option, and then the third one is flying helicopters. So very diverse, and not everybody goes through the same chain in the training command, depending at certain decision times about which pipeline you're headed for. From the beginning, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, so in my estimation, things worked out really well for me.
So you obviously got posted to the F-8. So what were your first thoughts of the aircraft?
Well, the F-8, let me back up a little bit, is you have to understand the whole organization of naval aviation at that time from the carrier-based standpoint. They would have all the airplanes on the carrier deck, on any individual carrier, are all from the same organization called an air wing. Now, the air wing would normally be made up of 2 squadrons designated as fighter squadrons, and then the number of attack squadrons would be a little bit flexible, but usually at least 3 other squadrons that are designated as attack squadrons. So in the fighter community back then, they had basically going down a philosophy that they had night fighters and day fighters. And when the F-8 was initially introduced to the Navy, it was classified as a day fighter. The night fighter, or the all-weather fighter, was being handled by other designs at the time. And so that was going to change very quickly. In fact, it changed before I got to the fleet. The F-8 they really no longer had day and night fighters. The F-8 was considered an all-weather fighter. And the reason is that how the fighters get the all-weather designation was the introduction of radar that was essentially a search, track, and missile guidance radar. Right. Whereas the F-8 initial models of the the F-8 had a radar, but it was only a ranging radar, which was used for the gun sight and had no search capability. Well, as the various models of the F-8 came online, they ended up with more capable radars. And the squadron that I went to, we had the latest version of the F-8. At the time, it was called the 2NE, and it had a relatively capable search and track radar, although the F-8 never got a radar-guided forward-firing missile.
So could you tell us a bit about your ground training on the F-8? That must have been quite intense.
Well, for anybody coming out of the training command, the biggest challenge that lied ahead was to be a pilot in a squadron that is deployed on the carrier, because that changes the whole game as far as what you need to perform, if you will, in order to hold up your end of the bargain. So in the Crusader rag, there was a strong emphasis on fighter tactics, air to air, if you will. And basically, the F-8 had established a reputation as a very demanding airplane to land on the carrier. So that was obviously an area where, as you go through the training squadron, they try to do the best they can to simulate what it's like to operate off the carrier. But obviously, the simulation never really does the true thing justice. Mm-hmm. And the big challenge in carrier aviation from a landing standpoint is operating at night. And you get some exposure to that before you reach the point where you're expected to do it. But it's, in all respects, it's rather limited. You get each landing that you arrest on a carrier, it's called a trap. And you have to successfully do 6 traps at night in the airplane in order to qualify. Well, that's hardly enough to make you real comfortable in the environment.
So let's talk about your first flight. Can you remember it, and what was it like having that afterburner?
Well, that was the other aspect of it, the training command. I essentially went through the entire pipeline that ended up in being able to go to fighters. But in the initial primary training, basic training, and advanced training, all of them had models of airplanes that had a two-seat option, if you will. Mm-hmm. And when I say two-seat, it had flight controls in both cockpits. So when you were introduced to the airplane, you would have a instructor sitting behind you and what have you. The only time they deviated from that was the last airplane that you flew. In my case, it was a F-11, which was a Grumman airplane, and there was never a two-seat version. So the first time you flew the airplane was all by yourself. And coincidentally, it was the first airplane you flew with an afterburner. And a very limited experience with that. Something that my recollection is you got about 20 hours in the airplane, but it was air-to-air gunnery and tactics and whatever. So it was very worthwhile. Now going to the F-8 was a whole different ballgame, because to compare the afterburner and the F-11 with that of the F-8 was night and day. And the history of the F-8, only one airplane was ever built with a second cockpit in it. And that was a road that the Navy decided not to go down. So it was, in essence, the first time you flew the airplane, you were all by yourself. And the first time you lit the afterburner, you were all by yourself. So it was quite an experience. But at that point in your career, you're quite capable of handling that situation.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how the F-8 handled, and what were its strengths and weaknesses.
Well, when you get to fighter aviation, and certainly in the Navy standpoint, there's a lot of things that are important in the airplane, not the least of which is the performance and the handling qualities. And both of those were significant upgrades to what had preceded it, particularly in the performance area. So you got quite comfortable with the airplane. And the biggest challenge continued to lie ahead, and that was operating at night off the carrier, particularly at night.
So that must have been, yeah, quite scary. But let's talk about some of your initial flying training. So yeah, what would you be conducting in this training phase before you went to your frontline squadron?
Well, as you can imagine, they divide up the syllabus into sections that initially is just the FAM to get out and fly the airplane and what have you. Then you would have sprinkled throughout the training was air-to-air combat, because that was the primary mission of the airplane. You did get a chance to do air-to-air gunnery with the airplane. At the time, it was a single mission airplane, and it had no air-to-ground capability other than the strafing with the 20 millimeter guns that the airplane had. So you go through these various phases. Another one would be instrument training, where you would fly on the airways or anywhere at night or in weather, what have you, to generate proficiency in flying the airplane on instruments.
So let's talk a bit about, because obviously it was a carrier-based aircraft as well. So talk us about, how your training to land and take off a carrier, because you mentioned before, but that must have been absolutely terrifying, to be honest.
Well, it's a known challenge for everybody that is going to a carrier-based platform, whether it be attack or fighter or whatever. And so the practicing landing, what they do is they'll designate an outlying field somewhere that there's a carrier deck painted on the runway, and there's a lens, an optical landing system, just as exactly what you have on the carrier. Mm-hmm. And so you go out and you practice there in the daytime, but they also try to select a location that there's not a whole lot of population around, mainly because ideally you don't want any other lights, for instance, of civilization, if you will, because that gives you some information that you won't have when you go to the ship. Mm-hmm. So what they had in what I went through at Cecil Field down in Florida, they had a very effective outline field. And when I say effective, there were cases where people would go on their first hop, which would be dedicated to practice landings, and they couldn't find the field. But you get accustomed to it, and once again, it does the best they can to simulate the carrier environment, but that basically that nothing is like the carrier.
So let's talk about your first frontline squadron, and what was it like being posted to that first frontline squadron? Now I'm part of a team here. What was that like for you?
The squadron I was assigned to was deployed. In other words, they were already on the carrier over in the Med. And so ideally, you'd like to join a squadron that's in the workups, because it just builds your time in the airplane and gets you more familiar with it. But you get, when you're ordered to a deployed squadron, you're thrown in the briar patch right away. It was an additional part of the challenge, but the squadron I went to was extremely strong. Fighter squadrons, all squadrons, vary a little bit in their overall reputation and what have you. I was very fortunate to go to an extremely strong squadron, which means that the people that are bringing you along are very highly qualified.
Yeah, so talk us through DACT or ACM in the F-8 and how did it fare against, the types of the time?
Well, that was one of the things they emphasized in going through the training squadron. And the F-8 had was an excellent airplane in terms of maneuverability, performance, what have you. And so what tactics you would use, that's part of learning to be a fighter pilot, is everything is driven by who is the adversary. And so they try to give you a little bit of exposure to various different platforms, because depending on the platform depends on how you would employ the F-8 against it. The other characteristic of the F-8 is that to get the maximum performance of the airplane, and this is true of all airplanes, you have to fly it very close to the maneuvering margins. And the penalty of exceeding those is the airplane potentially could depart controlled flight. And the F-8 had a great reputation for that, because if you ventured into that, the airplane could do virtually anything, including tumble and what have you. It just was a real experience. And I had a unique experience, or unique for me, is that the training squadron decided that they needed to expose all the students to out of control flight.
Right.
So I happened to be in the syllabus at the proper time, and was one of the first students to go through this, where you would go out and intentionally depart the airplane and then recover it. And the flight was very successful, but I'll have to admit that in the debrief, when the instructor would ask you to describe each time you departed the airplane, basically it was very difficult to tell, because just was something that at that point all you're worried about is recovering the airplane. Mm-hmm. So it was a good idea, but I was one of the few students that did it. I was told after I had left the training squadron, and not too many people had gone through the syllabus, they deleted that part of it. Right. Because the strategy there is to teach the student how to recover the airplane. And they had some very close cases with other students, so they deleted it.
How did the engine perform in the F-8? Was it the right engine for the aircraft?
Yeah, it definitely was. It represented the technology that was available at the time. It was the J-57. It had a lot, by those standards in that day, it had an awful lot of thrust. It was, once again, representative of the current technology in that the fuel control was all mechanical. It was reliable. And so they later on, Chance Watt went and built one airplane that was going to be the follow-on for the F-8, and they put a J-75 in it, which was a J-57 on steroids. And the performance, as you might imagine, was incredible. So for the technology that was available, the J-57 was a great engine.
Mm-hmm. So talk us through the cockpit. Was it comfortable for you as a pilot?
Yeah, it had a very, very roomy cockpit, if you will. And they had paid attention in the design, so the field of view out of the cockpit was certainly good. But this was before the advent of bubble canopies, which obviously optimizes the view in all quadrants. So, but It was a very comfortable cockpit.
What was it like being, in the F-8 on board on the boat? Am I saying boat or is it ship? I always get these confused.
Well, there's all kinds of names for the boat, the ship, whatever. Uh, it was a highlight of my entire life because the camaraderie and the trust and admiration you have for everybody around you has never been replicated. I mean, if you stop to think about it, that the simple act of just launching and recovering on the airplane involves a whole lot of people, starting at the squadron level, the people that maintain the airplane. But then when you get to the airplane on the flight deck, there are all kinds of people with specific tasks on the flight deck. The astounding thing was that the majority, the average age of these troops that were out there that taxied you around, hooked you up, made sure that you were correctly hooked on the catapult when you recover to help you clear the landing area, what have you. The average age was less than 20.
Wow.
And these folks, it was amazing to me because the flight deck always has, when you're doing flight outs, there's always wind over deck. Weather is, it could be raining, could be sleeting, could be almost anything. And these troops worked extremely long hours and almost without exception always had a smile on their face. So it was just wonderful people.
And was there much banter on the ship, the boat, between other types of aircraft that were on that carrier?
Well, to say that there's a rivalry would be an understatement. And particularly in the fighter community, that when you were operating and any other airplane that you could find in the area or came across was fair game. And so basically what you would do is to jump them, if you will, and try to maneuver till they're 6 o'clock. So it was great training for lookout doctrine. And it was great training for all the pilots in the air wing because having a good lookout doctrine is very, very important to survival in a hostile environment. The flying was just very demanding, but very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. And which is, I mean, this phrase or the statement goes around. Do you think the F-8 was the last of the gunfighters?
Well, that was certainly people in the F-8 community believe that. I would be one of them, but you know, the wisdom or the accuracy of the statement is borne out by the fighter that replaced the F-8 was the Phantom, and the Navy Phantom never got a gun, and it was exercising the philosophy, a flawed philosophy, that dogfighting was a thing of the past, and there wasn't any reason to have a gun, and that turned out to be obviously recognized as incorrect, as evidenced by the F-14 and the F-18, which were the following fighters. Both of them had an internal gun.
Mm-hmm. So did you ever take the F-8 into combat or live theatre?
No, I was on the wrong coast. I was on the East Coast. And what the Navy was doing at that time is rotating an East Coast carrier over to the Western Pacific on a rotational basis. And we were scheduled to go as an air wing. This was after we had transitioned to F-4s. And then before, and it turned out that the carrier was slipped one slot, and that put it after I had left the squadron for my next set of orders.
So yeah, I'm I'm going to guess you have so many memorable stories here, Kurt, but can you maybe share one or two with our viewers of your time on the Crusader?
Well, we enjoyed the airplane. It attracted a certain breed of pilot, which I certainly enjoyed being in their company. Everything was about pride in your performance. And so you were always working as hard to be the best you could. You always felt you had the best airplane in the airwing. Mm-hmm. You had the best squadron in the airwing. And so having in a squadron is just a highlight of the career of a naval aviator.
So how many hours did you get on the jet, and did you enjoy it?
Very much so. My exposure to the Crusader didn't end when I left the squadron. Well, excuse me. While I was still in the squadron, the squadron transitioned to F-4s, to Phantoms. So, but that wasn't the end of my F-8 time, because when I went to test pilot school and then was assigned as a test pilot at Patuxent River, I did an awful lot of work with the modifications to the Crusader. So I don't know what my total number of hours. I've never been one to. Some aviators will be able to quote to the nearest tenth of an hour, or how many landings day and night they had. I'm not one of them. But I know on my first cruise I ended up with over 100 landings. So with that, just have to stick. That's an event for an aviator, because then you become a centurion. In other words, you've made 100 landings on the same ship. But other than that, I can't quote the numbers.